everyone. A couple of years ago, I did my first ever talk for 5x15, and it was actually a few months after I got injured. I'm not going to talk much about what happened to me tonight, but just to explain, I was injured in Afghanistan. I lost both my legs and my arm, and I'd spent about a year in hospital, and the first opportunity I got to kind of be out in public, one of the first times I was actually out of hospital, was to do a 5x15 talk. Now, keeping a guy in hospital for pretty much a year, it drives you a little crazy. And so suddenly I was at this table with loads of free wine. I was with a friend. I was still in a wheelchair at that stage, and I hadn't really had much to drink in that year. And I'm kind of hitting the wine going, this is great. My friend's going, well, you know, you've got to talk. Be fine. I think you should slow down. So we came up with a system, which is a very simple one. So it was 5 times 150 mils. So I worked out I could pace myself. So tonight, having 6 has kind of thrown me. In fact, I should say as well, it's probably slightly my fault that there is 6 speakers. I've been in Lebanon for the last few months. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. It's pretty much absorbed my life completely. I went there as a photographer with the charity Handicap International, and I was so moved by the stories and the characters, the people that I met there, that I went back and back again, and ended up making a film for Channel 4 as well. And for over 4 months, it completely took over my life, to the extent that when the film finally came out, my friends said, you need to take a complete day off, not do anything, and threatened, my sister was going to take my phone away from me, my laptop was taken away. And so I went to have a nice quiet day at the Barbican. And then I bumped into the 5x15 team. And so immediately it was like, oh, I've got to come and do a talk, I've got to come and do a talk, which they very kindly agreed to just about a week ago. So then, of course, I walked away going, well, that's really stupid. I just made a film so I wouldn't have to talk about it. But anyway, so tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about 3 things. One is the characters, some of the characters in the film. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of being a photographer and how I work, and a little bit about the process of why this film was made. I'm going to start with a little clip from the film. As I say, I've been in Lebanon documenting Syrian refugees for a few months. There are approximately 6 million displaced from Syria now. The war's been going on for over 4 years. It's probably one of the most brutal conflicts that's happened in the world since the Second World War. There are 3 million refugees living in neighboring countries. There are 1.5 million living in Lebanon. That's a country of 4 million people. So their population has increased by over 25% in under 4 years. It's the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War, and one of the great crises this world has ever faced. But among all those statistics are people. Among all those statistics are individuals, families, communities completely destroyed by the conflict. And whilst the news tends to focus on those fighting the conflict, my priority has always been to find out what happens to the civilians caught up in it, and most especially the most vulnerable. So I'm going to show you a little clip from the film. This is actually more just to get a cheap laugh, I'm hoping. If you don't laugh, I'll be really upset. This is one of the characters I met, an incredibly inspiring character called Ahmed. Ahmed lost both his legs, as will be explained, in a rocket attack. But rather than feeling sorry for himself, rather than going through self-pity, which I personally got very good at, he decided to do something positive. And so he still doesn't have 2 working prosthetic legs, but already has converted a motorbike so he can go out and help other refugees. They are visiting Ahmed. He lost his legs after a rocket attack in Syria. This brings back a lot of memories, but I have to say it's a lot more fun watching. He arrived in the country over 2 years ago, while there was still decent accommodation available, which the UN paid for. Actually, we have almost identical injuries. Despite his injuries, Ahmed has begun working as a volunteer with the UN, helping other disabled refugees.
لكن أنت بتعرف كثير ناس هون بحاجة مساعدة.
أنا بطبيعة عملي إنه مندوب بفتل عن المسؤولين وكذا، يعني بيطلع معي حالات كذا، بحب أنا أوصلهم لكم تقدروا تساعدوني.
Every day, he travels out to visit people in the neighborhood. On a bike, he adapted himself.
حطينا نحن ضفنا دولاب من هون ودولاب من الطرف الثاني مشان التوازن.
And this bit here?
هي مشان تقول غيار فتيس.
Okay, so the big question, can I have a go? Okay, so it's one bike, 2 men, no legs. What's the worst that could happen?
ولا شيء.
It was actually one of those things I hadn't really thought through, and as we went around the corner, it kind of went down this quite steep hill, and he got faster and faster. Of course, as I tried to kind of grab hold of him, he's got no support as well, so the two of us almost came off the back. But anyway, today, I just wanted to talk a little bit more, as I say, about the stories, some of the individuals that are caught up in this huge humanitarian disaster. People say to me, it must be very strange going to refugee camps. What are the people like there? And I hate that word, refugees. As soon as you say refugees, you think, I don't understand these people. As soon as you say Syrians, as soon as you say Muslims, then it's easy to distance yourself. But when I go to a refugee camp, I find taxi drivers, I find lawyers, I find doctors, I find teachers. I find mothers, I find fathers, I find children, grandparents. I find people with all the same hopes and desires that all of us have, and yet they're thrown into terrible circumstance. I wanted to share stories tonight of some of those vulnerable dealing with that crisis. This is a woman called Khalida. Khalida was in her garden in Syria. They were running short of food, and so she had started planting things in the garden. She was out there with her kids when a sniper shot her in the spine. She was shot in the neck. She fell in front of her kids. Her family managed to get her out of Syria. She was treated. She's now tetraplegic. One of the things I should say about Lebanon is the infrastructure can't cope with the number of refugees there, and no official camps have been built, which means getting aid to people is a great problem. And most people don't have the kind of shelter they need to live in. So Khalida was living in a shack that was made of cardboard. As I say, she's tetraplegic now, so she can't move anything below her neck down. Her husband has become her full-time carer, and they struggle to cope with the children. I asked her what her dream was. What is it that you hope for? And she said to me, I just want to be a mother again. And I said, well, what do you mean exactly? And she said, every day I hear my kids outside playing, and I hear maybe my boy fall over and he scratches his knee, and he comes in and he lifts his hand and puts it on the wound, but I can't feel it. This is Reem, who lives a few miles away. She's a very good example of the inadequate housing and terrible circumstance that many of these people have to live in. She lost her legs in a rocket attack. Her husband was killed. One of her daughters was killed. She lost her leg, but when she got to Lebanon, the only place she could find to live on was on the top of a 5th floor of a building that's still being renovated. She was so embarrassed by what happened to her, she didn't even want her children to see her. She said, until I've learnt to walk again, I won't have them to visit. But she lives on this building, really a prisoner, because with her new prosthetic leg, she can't even get down the stairs. But even when people find housing, it's not necessarily the answer. This is Noor. Noor left Syria after, again, her house was bombed. Her young son managed to escape the bomb, but he fell out the 3rd story of a building and shattered his hip. She wasn't able to get him any medical treatment in Syria, so they crossed the border. Soon after crossing the border, her husband had to go back to try and get his mother. She hasn't heard of him again. As a result, they were left living on the street. They were homeless. There was nowhere for them to turn. Try and put yourself in that situation, with a son who has a fractured hip, who desperately needs an operation and is unable to move, and yet you're living on the street with your other daughter. In the end, a man took her in. She wouldn't say exactly what went on, but all she would say is that he didn't treat her in the right way. But at least her son had a bed to sleep in. And it's not just the physical damage. This is Bana. Bana is a young girl, incredibly amazing girl, actually. But her life has been blighted by war. In fact, half her life has been in conflict. In Syria, her house was attacked various times. It was on the front line between two warring factions. She was shot by her neighbor who was 5 years old. He had found a gun lying around because there are guns everywhere now in Syria, and he accidentally shot her. She went to hospital. While she was in hospital, she saw all the dead bodies being brought in from a chemical attack. She was so traumatized by that, she left the hospital screaming to everybody, run away, or else you will die like they do. When she got home, she wouldn't leave her mother's side. Her hair started falling out. She started biting her brothers and sisters. She became impossible to control. Added to that, the house was then attacked again. Another rocket hit the house, injuring her brother. She was injured in the stomach. Her family managed to flee to Lebanon, where I'm glad to say Handicap International started looking after her and dealing with her PTSD. But she's a lucky one. There are hundreds of thousands of children who are leaving Syria who are getting no treatment for the trauma that they've had there. Many of them haven't been to school for 3 or 4 years. Most of them have seen death. Most of them have seen family members die. And yet that will be the generation that's expected to rebuild that country. This is Salim. Salim I met again living on the 5th floor of a building near the Syrian border. I asked him, why would you live up here? His answer was very simple. He said, I may be thrown out of my country. I may never be able to return home. But every day I see the sun rise on the mountains that are Syria. And that's one of the things that I learned from every single person I met there. When you ask them what is their greatest wish, it's always to return home. And when I ask NGOs and when I ask charities, what's the answer to the crisis in Syria? It's simple again. It's peace in Syria. And while we're at a moment in history where we're deciding that it's advantageous or the right thing to do to bomb ISIS, and I won't argue whether that is or isn't, what we must remember is the people caught up in the conflict are people like this. And whilst we must do something to fight evil, we must also flex our muscles for humanity. We must support the families, the communities, and the individuals that will be the future of that country. I'm going to talk about one particular character that for me was the reason I went back again and again. And it's a young girl called Aya. Aya is an incredibly feisty 4-year-old. Well, she's 5 now. She's just been her birthday. She has spina bifida. She's paralyzed from the waist down. When I first met her, I was introduced to her, and she was living in one of these makeshift tents. There are about 1,600 of these makeshift camps around Lebanon, and she was living in one of them in a place that was made from bits of movie posters and any scraps of material you could find. And I met Aya, and I thought, I can't take her photograph. She was sat there in front of me, and she looked so vulnerable. She looked so weak. I don't like people to be victims in my photographs, in my work. I see people as victims of circumstance, but not victims in their own right. But looking at Aya, this 4-year-old with spina bifida, I could only see a victim. So I said, I won't take a photograph. But I went back the next day, and then I went back a week later, and I started visiting again and again. And what I started to learn was actually how feisty she is. I started to learn what a character she is. And I started to see her interacting with her siblings, and I thought, no, I do want to photograph her. And her mother was telling me the story about how they escaped from Syria. Their house had been bombed, and they'd hidden in the basement. And then she stopped me. And she said, no, I shouldn't be telling the story. It should be her sister Iman, who's only 11 years old. And Iman started telling me the story about how she had held Aya since she was a baby. She'd always held her. And so when the house was bombed, it felt natural that she would pick her up and take her to the basement. And for 10 days, she held her in the basement, this 10-year-old holding her 4-year-old sister. They had no water, they had no electricity, they had no sanitation while the house was constantly being bombed. And then when they escaped from Syria for 2 months, she carried her to cross the border. And then they started telling me about how they still play hopscotch every day. They would go and play outside. And so I said, can I come and take a photograph of you doing that? And they said, yes, of course. And that's when I really captured the spirit of Aya and her sister. And it's very easy to see refugees as kind of downtrodden people. It's easy to see it on the news and say, I don't get these people. As I was saying at the beginning, how do I relate to a Muslim, a Syrian, a refugee? But when you see a picture like that, think of your nephews, your nieces, your own children. Think of the people you know. Their lives were exactly the same. Their hopes, their desires are exactly the same. As kids, they just want to go and play. And yet everything they have has been taken away from them, and all they want is to rebuild their lives. Just how bad is it? This is the next door neighbor of Aya, Kuala. She's 10 years old, and only a couple of weeks ago she tried to kill herself by taking rat poison because she could not deal with living in that camp anymore. There are people here tonight from Handicap International, the charity I've been working with. I would ask you to at least take 5 minutes at the end of this talk just to speak to them. People always say to me, oh, but what can I do? The crisis is too big. How can I help 3 million people? Well, I'm not asking any of you to help 3 million people, but each one of you could improve the lives of one of these refugees, and that makes a difference. I'm going to actually leave the last words tonight to Aya. When winter comes, it will bring storms and freezing temperatures. Aya's family are doing their best to get ready.
طب ليش ما عملت ريم من ذاك الجنب؟ أنا ما بدي من هذا الجنب.
So is this getting ready for the winter?
هون في عنا كثير عواصف. على البحر عواصف كثير. بدنا نمكن نشدها كثير عشان قد ما صار عواصف تضلها ثابتة.
عشان ما نقعد بالليل ما نلاقيها. نلاقيها طايرة.
حطوا حجارة محمد، حطوا حجارة نقدحوا عليها. هي حطها.
ليش ما حطيته ورا؟
Every time I see her, Aya is like a shining light. She's always smiling. She must mean so much to all of you.
هي بتحسسنا إنه بحياة حلوة قد من كان. حتى هن تشوفوا عزة بس هي قوية آية. آية قوية بكل شيء يعني ما كان احتمال ولا نسبة 1% تعيش وعايشة.
في دكاترة عنا في سوريا أعطوها مهلة إنه ما بتعيش لحد الشهرين. كثر الأدوية والعناية صار عمر 5 سنوات.
Do you think this is going to hold out against the winter?
ما بتزبط يعني بدنا نطير بدنا يعني نتعذب فيها.
شلون بقى نهاي الشتوي نحن اجينا ونحن بوجهنا وجه البحر، اجباري نحن ما نطوف ونسبح بالمي.
بدنا نطوف بالمي.
How do you think Aya is going to cope with the winter?
خايفة آية في هالظروف هاي يصيبها شيء بالبرد، وآية صعب عليها البرد. ولا احتمال انه تعيش 1% في البرد اذا ما كان عناية فيها بيت دفى. آية ما بتموت. آية بدها تعيش.
Thank you.